to read this because there's so many wonderful things to say about Adam. I'm honored to be able to introduce Professor Adam Cohen to you today. For those of you who might not know me, my name is Kathy Johnson, and I have the distinct honor of being the first student to receive the doctoral hood from Professor Adam Cohen. And we continue to work together to this day, so I know him fairly well. By way of introduction, I want to remind you of Professor Cohen's accomplishments, provide you with some lesser-known facts about him, and finally, give you some insights into what makes Adam so successful. Adam earned his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2001. His graduate advisor was the great Paul Rosen. Now, you can imagine that being accepted as Paul Rosen's graduate student was no small thing. But Dr. Rosen had a test for his prospective students, and if the student could find a tortilla press in Philadelphia, that he or she would be accepted. And Adam, being the enterprising fellow that he is, went out and found a tortilla press. And I think that incident inspired Adam because he still expects his students today to have a lot of ingenuity. So after graduating, Adam held several postdoc positions at the Solomon Asch Center for the Study of Ethno-Political Conflict, the Center for the Study of Religion, Spirituality, and Health at Duke University, where he worked with Harold Koenig, and the Institute of Personality and Social Research, where he worked with Dr. Keltner. He then taught for a year at Philadelphia University before coming to ASU in 2006 as an assistant professor. And during his tenure at ASU, Adam has brought in an impressive $8.9 million in external funding. He has also published 57 peer-reviewed papers, has authored 2 books, one of which is up here, and 15 book chapters. He's published 9 commentaries and presented 88 conference papers. He's published in Psychological Science, Evolution and Human Behavior, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, and many others. A little known fact, however, is that Adam's first authored publication was How Golden Hamsters Distinguish Top from Bottom Flank Scents. And you can ask him about that after the talk. But thankfully for us, Adam realized that he liked people better than hamsters. And now he's much better known for his most frequently cited paper, Many Forms of Culture, which was published in American Psychologist in 2009. And in that article, Adam argues that religion is just one of the many ways that we can conceptualize culture. And indeed, Adam is recognized nationally and internationally by his peers as both an expert in the psychology of religion and in cultural psychology. In 2009, he received the APA Margaret Gorman Early Career Award from Division 36. In 2013, he was awarded the Godin Prize by the International Association for the Psychology of Religion, an honor that is bestowed only once every 4 years. But the award that he's probably the most proud of, and the one that he lobbied the longest and the hardest for, was Keith Serenik's Department Chair Gumby Award, which he received in 2012 for his exemplary flexibility in departmental service. In terms of service external to the department, he served on multiple external grant review committees. He served as assistant editor and on the editorial boards of 7 different journals. And he's currently an associate editor for the leading journal in our field, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And in addition to this long list of accomplishments, which have led to this well-deserved promotion to full professor, there are qualities that can't be listed on a person's CV. Adam is likable. I've been to a lot of conferences with Adam, and you will see that people always seek him out. He organizes taco night, for example, at SPSP. And I'm really impressed by the number of times each year he's invited to present at this or that conference. He's got a very dry wit, and I think he amuses even himself.
Especially himself.
I asked for some tips, for example, in preparing this introduction, and he sent me a recipe for barbecue steak tips. Well, that's Adam. And Adam is a good man. One of the things that impressed me the most about Adam when I first attended his lab meeting in 2006 was that some people were making sexually crude jokes, And Adam said very kindly but very firmly, "Hey, keep it clean. This is a family lab." And I appreciated that. Adam likes Adam likes cheesesteaks. He likes rock climbing, being married to Kristen, and he's a good daddy to his son Graydon. And he's a good mentor. He's given me and each of his other students the absolute freedom to explore their ideas and to let them make their mistakes. You can take a 40-page manuscript and restructure it just like that. Sometimes he spouts off such eloquent thoughts and helps me pull my thoughts together. I hurry up to scribble down what he's written. He's terrific at addressing questions after a talk. And Adam understands religion. He understands the tenets of all the major monotheistic faiths. He gets the heartbeat of the people who are religious. He really is an expert in this field. And I know you'll enjoy his talk. Professor Adam B. Cohen.
Thank you, Kathy. That's why I asked you to get there. It's really wonderful to be presenting to this group. The last time I did this, I think, was my job talk. A few of you were here. So what I wanted, you were there? Wow. What I wanted to do to cover for today was to claim that religions are often meaningfully different from each other. We don't need to pretend that all religions are the same. They're also often similar to each other, which is not really the point I'm going to dwell on today, but make the case that there are positive implications of this for intergroup trust, and it's not that religions are different, therefore society is doomed. And what I wanted to do was to structure this talk in three broad sections. The first was to review the work on these topics that brought me to ASU. And as I look around the room, this was work that brought me here, that I presented in my job talk. But now that I'm looking around the room, few of us were here. And those of us that were here are quite old by now and probably don't remember at all what I might have said. And so this was work that, as Kathy mentioned, I did my PhD with Paul Raz, and this is work from my dissertation with Paul. And the broader context of that work was I was trying to fit the study of religion into psychology at all. Religion really wasn't studied at all in mainstream psychology around 2000 when I got my PhD, and more particularly into cultural psychology. And the way that I wanted to do that was to ask the question of when religions seem to show theological differences from each other. If you read the texts of the religions, do those differences filter into the cultures of the people that make up those religions? So if, for example, Protestantism says that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery, and maybe other religions don't say that, do members of those religions actually espouse those different viewpoints? Or is it the case that all religions, when you boil them down, are essentially the same? We talk about Judeo-Christian religion, maybe these are all essentially the same. Or maybe the texts of the religions are different, but that really doesn't affect the way that modern people, modern Americans, think and feel about things. So I needed to find an area in which religions had something non-trivially different to say about some issue, so that I could investigate whether members of those different religions would espouse those points of view. I didn't want to look at something like murder and ask people, well, do you think it's wrong to murder, and why do you think that? And someone might say, well, it's in the Ten Commandments. Probably anybody thinks that it's wrong to murder, whether it's in the Ten Commandments or not. And I didn't want to find something that I thought was really sort of trivially obvious. So in the field of marketing, for example, there's that idea, what do they call that, Joe, when they observe that Muslims buy less pork in the supermarket than Christians do? Segmented marketing or something? I thought that was sort of trivial, but I wanted to find something psychologically interesting and important. And so I settled on the moral importance of thoughts, just like Jimmy Carter thought that looking at a woman lustfully was the same as adultery. That point of view was not represented in any denomination of Judaism. In Jewish theology, and I wanted to ask, is this true of Jewish culture? Behaving a certain way is a lot more important than what you think or feel. And here are a couple of examples why you might say that. First of all, If you are a Talmudic rabbi and you go through the first 5 books of Moses and you count up every time you said it says to do something, honor your mother and father, or it says don't do something, don't commit adultery, you get 613 of those. That includes a few rabbinic commandments, but there are 613 commandments. Only 20 or so of those have anything to do with an internal state of mind. Honor your mother and father, don't covet your neighbor's stuff, believe in God might be a biblical commandment, the wording is a little bit ambiguous. But the other 600 are behaviors. Don't murder, don't steal, leave the corners of your field for the poor, and so on. And one of the jobs that Talmudic rabbis thought that they had was to interpret these very vague sounding internal commandments into behavioral terms. So they weren't satisfied with the commandment, honor your parents. What does that mean? How do you know if someone's honoring their parents or not? Well, the rabbis explained that what this means is that you should take care of them. You should feed them and clothe them and make sure that they're respected. It doesn't talk about how you feel about them inside. And there are even cases in Jewish philosophy where it's not that you're supposed to act the way that you feel, but sometimes you're supposed to act contrary to the way that you feel, because how you behave is more important than how you feel internally. And so there's a really good example of this where there's a discussion of, it's clear that you're not supposed to eat pork if you're Jewish. That's a biblical commandment in Leviticus and maybe Deuteronomy. Kathy? Leviticus? Okay.
Go.
Exodus?
Go.
Numbers?
Go.
Not eating pork. So there's a question, well, how should you feel about that? And one rabbi says, well, maybe you should feel that pork is disgusting and you never wanted to eat it anyway. And the decision that comes down is actually, no, that's not how you should feel. Because if you don't eat pork because it's disgusting, there's no virtue in that. It's easy not to eat foods that you find disgusting. You should want to eat pork and not do it because God commanded you not to. So sometimes you're supposed to act contrary to the way that you feel. And so I did a series of studies on this as part of my dissertation with Paul to ask whether these differences are actually represented in Jewish culture and in Protestant culture. So this was before power analyses were invented, and we had around 50 Jews and around 50 Protestants who were given a scenario about a young man, Mr. B, who has a colleague at work who's very attractive. They both know she'd be willing to have an affair with him, and for 20 minutes a day he thinks about having an affair with his colleague. And if you ask these subjects their moral impression of Mr. B as a result of these thoughts, with items like, is Mr. B a bad person? Or is it your gut reaction? I was influenced by the work of John Haidt back then because he's my academic brother. Is it your gut reaction that Mr. B is thinking about having an affair with his colleague is wrong? Protestants have a significantly worse impression of him than Jews do. And this is despite the fact that a lot of my Protestant subjects will say in the comments at the end of the survey, I really think it's important not to judge people, judge not lest ye be judged, hate the sinner, not the sin. They still scored lower on this scale. And I really wanted to make Dave happy when I was writing my dissertation. So I carried out a series of mediation analyses trying to understand what does being raised in or committed to a Protestant versus Jewish cultural environment result in, which ultimately results in your negative moral impression of Mr. B. And it's not, there's not a mediating effect here. It's not that Protestants and Jews differ in how bad it is to actually have an affair. They hadn't actually invented bootstrap confidence intervals when I was in graduate school, so these are all Sobel tests. And at best, how controllable the thoughts are part of the story. There is a significant A path and a significant B path, and the effect size does change somewhat, but it's hardly reduced to 0. This may be part of the story. And likewise, the same thing for how likely Mr. B is to have an affair. If Mr. B is thinking about a colleague lustfully, Protestants do think that he's going to have an affair, more so than Jews do, and that does translate into more negative moral impressions. But again, that is a significant mediator, but it's not full mediation. But the best single possible mediator of this effect is that Protestants agree much more than Jews do that thinking about an immoral action is as bad as doing it, which is just what it says in the Sermon on the Mount. And that really fully explains, if you want to use that one mediator, why Protestants have a more negative impression of Mr. B than Jews do. So the next study we did was we wondered how general of an effect this is. Is it only those offenses that Jesus mentioned in the Sermon on the Mount, having anger in your heart and having lust in your heart, or do Protestants consider all kinds of thoughts to be morally relevant? So I couldn't really come up with a scenario that would be different enough from lust and anger, but Paul Rosen used to bring his dog Pandy to work with him. And you'd be sitting in Paul's office working on your dissertation, and Pandy would come over and get a cookie from you, and you would pet Pandy, and then he would bite you for no reason whatsoever. So what happens if Mr. B gets a bad grade and he's thinking about poisoning his professor's dog? You actually get the same Protestant-Jewish difference in moral judgment of those kinds of thoughts. Even though there's nothing in the Sermon on the Mount about thinking about harming an animal is as bad as doing it. The last time I gave this talk, I think it was at, well, not this talk, but presented these data, I think it was at Paul Rosen's Festschrift. And I found out that Pandy had crossed the Rainbow Bridge, and I feel a little bad about this slide now. So next time, there won't be this slide in the talk. But the same mediators seem to pop out. Again, it's not that they differ in how bad it is to actually harm an animal. How controllable are the thoughts? This time there wasn't a significant mediating effect. Although likelihood, again, did seem to be a bit of the story. And again, if you ask Jews and Protestants, how bad is it to think about an immoral action? Is that as bad as doing it? That shows a substantial mediating effect. Again, even for an offense that really has nothing to do with anything that's explicitly mentioned in the Sermon on the Mount. So I think these are broader, these get translated into broader cultural notions on the parts of Jews and Protestants that thoughts are either morally important or they aren't. So that was kind of the work that brought me to ASU. I interviewed here for a culture position, and I said religions are cultures, and they're very complex cultures. Sometimes these messages get absorbed, maybe sometimes they don't, maybe that was a future direction. But when I got here, I started working with people like Kathy, with another graduate student, Jessica Lee, who's now on the faculty at the University of Kansas Business School. And my work on these topics got a little bit more subtle. And what do I mean by more subtle? I think it got more theoretically sophisticated as a result of working with these students and more methodologically sophisticated, maybe from being around these students and maybe being in this department in general. And so we started working on another topic to ask, are there cultural differences in another domain of social psychology attributable to religion? And we started looking at the fundamental attribution error, and this is because Kathy had a theory that Protestants believe in an internal soul in a particular way. Even more so than other Christians, than Catholic Christians, and that this might make them more prone to the fundamental attribution error, Protestants even more so than Catholics. So the fundamental attribution error, or the fundamentalist attribution error if you like, is when you think that people act the way they do because of the kinds of people they are, as opposed to their contexts. And Kathy thought this was because of belief in a soul, that you have this internal disembodied soul, and that's why you act the way that you do in Protestantism. So when someone exhibits a certain behavior, you ask, what kind of person is this inside driving that behavior? And you don't have a purely mechanistic or materialistic view of the person, such that you can swap out somebody's brain. This is Igor from Young Frankenstein. And they become a different person. That may be, that's not a Protestant view. So we did a couple of experiments and studies on this, which likewise ended up in JPSP, much to my delight. We had, see now they had invented power analysis. There were more Protestants and more Catholics than in the prior studies that I mentioned. We gave them these attribution scenarios, which if you're not a social psychologist, Sarah Martin is a corporate executive who donated a lot of medication to Africa. Why did she do that? Did she do that because of the kind of person she is? Or did she do that because anybody in her position would have done that? And so we can compute how much are people favoring the internal attributions versus the external attributions. We also measured how much people believe in a soul. And we found that Protestants, more so than Catholics, made more internal attributions, but there was no difference in external attributions. Protestants believed more in this personal internal soul than Catholics did. And to make Dave, they still hadn't invented bootstrapping. to make Dave happy, we ran a mediation analysis and showed that part of the reason why Protestants exhibit more internal attributions is because they believe in the soul more so than Catholics do. So that was maybe a little bit more theoretically sophisticated, but being around people like Leona and Steve, who are sitting right here, and Dave, we wanted to be more methodologically sophisticated. And so we wanted to be sure that there actually was indeed a causal influence of that mediator, which we only had measured in the prior study, on the DV. And so we tried to experimentally manipulate belief in the soul. And so we asked Protestant subjects, write an essay about why you think the soul exists, or write an essay why you think the soul does not exist. And so we helped them. We said, well, medical science shows that people have these out-of-body, near-death experiences all the time. Doctors think that there's a soul. You might say that in your essay. Or we might say, doctors know that there isn't a soul. All of these near-death experiences can be straightforwardly explained, by neurobiological processes and so on. And they did that. And what we found was that when you had people write essays that there were souls, they jumped up in their internal attributions. Whereas that affected external attributions much less. And so we took that as causal evidence that it really is belief in the soul that's making Christians more prone to internal attributions. And so again, there are meaningful cultural differences between members of different religions. And why did we think that was an important finding? We thought that was an important finding because, first of all, there is a sizable literature in cultural psychology about attributions. And the big finding is that if you're a North American individualist, you really like internal attributions, but East Asian collectivists don't. They're much less prone to the fundamental attribution error. Well, one contribution of this research with Kathy and Jessica is that there are other cultural influences, including religion, on attribution processes. And moreover, in this paper, we pointed out that a lot of the research on culture and attributions, and indeed a lot of research on culture in general, often very much or completely confounds country and religion. So when Kai-Ping Pong and Michael Morris go to China, and they show that Chinese people don't exhibit the fundamental attribution error, but North Americans do, a lot of those Chinese subjects were not Christian. They might have been atheists. Whereas a lot of those North American subjects might have been Christian. Probably were. And so we raised the question in this paper, which I think is really an important and unresolved question, how much of cultural differences that we know about in social psychology are really due to religion as opposed to country of origin or ethnicity, which is what those differences get attributed to. But what are some of the implications of those differences? Well, we live in a multicultural society, and ever since November of last year, there's been a lot of discussion about whether members of different religions can get along. This is an older question than that, but it's been ramped up in a lot of ways in the last year or so. Sorry, 2 Novembers ago, I guess. And people that think that we can all get along often say that we can all get along because religions are essentially the same. And, Muslims may call God Allah, and Jews may call God Hashem or whatever, and Christians may call God God. Thank you. But it's all the same God, right? You hear that sort of sentiment a lot, right? We talk about Judeo-Christian religion, and so on. And therefore, it's okay. We can all get along with each other. Well, my research program with my students and others has shown that religions are not exactly all the same. They're actually sometimes meaningfully different from each other. Does this mean that we can't all get along? Well, over the past 3 years, this grant just ended. My lab had funding from the Air Force Office of Scientific Research to study culture, religion, and trust. And this was a little bit surprising to me that we got a grant from the Air Force to study culture, religion, and trust. The Air Force does not only fund grants to study things like missile guidance systems and bullet kinetics and things like that. I think they do fund that kind of research. Pilot performance and things like that, cognitive factors that make people have better reaction times, and so on. But they're also very interested in topics like trust. And this is because airmen come from very different cultural backgrounds. You might have an American airman who comes from a Muslim background operating on a team with a Jewish airman from an American background. And can those people get along? Can they really be trusted to depend on each other under fire? And U.S. military personnel operate in different multicultural environments. So the military actually has, I don't know if it's a strong interest in culture, but this is something that they are interested in. particularly as it applies to the cultivation of trust, the cultivation and assessment of trust. And so we wrote a grant, my lab wrote a grant saying that actually there's a lot of scholarship on religion and culture and trust, and this is something that we can investigate over the next couple of years, which we've been doing, and Jean is a co-PI on that grant. And so what we proposed is that if you want to send out trustworthy messages, or if you want to know whether to trust somebody else, there are three sets of sort of theories within religion that could help you. One of those has to do with really ancient ideas in social psychology about in-group and out-group identities. The second is supernatural monitoring theory, which I'll come to in a second. And the third is costly signaling theory, which Stephanie is very, very interested in. And the first one is that religion is social identity theory within social psychology. We like our in-groups better than we like our out-groups. And so you could make that very strong hypothesis from social psychology that religious people are going to trust their in-groups more than they're going to trust their out-groups. Although there is some interesting nuance here. So Will Gervais,
all of the above.
At the University of Kentucky, got his PhD with Aaron Orenzon at the University of British Columbia. He's been working on atheist distrust. And nobody trusts atheists. This is true in, Jordan, is it 27 countries around the world? 13. He showed in 13 countries around the world that there's a high level of distrust of atheists. And he thinks this is because atheists don't fear punishment from God, so they'll do anything. So we thought in-groups might trust in-groups more than they trust out-groups. Maybe not atheists, we weren't sure. Maybe atheists might even find other atheists untrustworthy. And why is that? Well, that's because his advisor, Aaron Orenzon, has this big gods, supernatural punishment, and supernatural monitoring hypothesis, which says that large-scale societies were able to develop because people got religion. And once they were afraid that a high, moralizing, omniscient, omnipotent God would punish them if they misbehaved, unrelated individuals could start trusting each other. You didn't need to only trust your kin anymore. You could trust other people if they believed in these gods. And so we made the hypothesis that if you want to assess somebody's trustworthiness, find out if they believe in a mean God. If they believe in a mean God, you should trust them. If they believe in a nice God, they'll steal your bike, right? Because God's just going to forgive them anyway. That's probably not a theologically correct viewpoint, but that's the theory. And finally, we were really interested, Stephanie, in costly signaling and trust. This is something Stephanie's been working on quite a lot. Religion often involves costly and hard-to-fake signals of commitment. So when you circumcise your children or when you wear a hijab, Stephanie, one thing that you might be doing among many motivations for that behavior or many functions of that behavior is signaling to other people, sometimes in very costly ways, that you're trustworthy, that you are committed to that religious group. And when push comes to shove, you're the guy to turn to. And so we made the hypothesis that when you see an in-group member costly signaling, that you would trust that person more. And when you see an out-group member, if you're a Christian, for example, and you see a Muslim woman wearing a hijab, you should trust that person less. Because what that Muslim woman is doing is signaling commitment to other Muslims and not to you. Those were the hypotheses. And this is the kind of prototypical study that we've been doing on this topic. Some of these results were published in Psychological Science in 2015. We would give people Facebook-like profiles. These, in the set of studies I'm about to talk about, these are all Christian ASU undergraduates. They'd invented power analysis by then, and these studies were adequately powered. So this guy, his name was always Ali. He was always a biology major. Oddly, he always didn't like ice cream, which I think was a good idea, because if you want to end up saying, I don't trust this guy, you don't need to say to yourself, well, he's Muslim and I don't trust him. You can say, that's weird, he doesn't like ice cream, I don't trust him. Half of the subjects saw him describe himself as a Muslim, and the other half saw him describe himself as a Christian. Half the subjects saw him believe in a punishing God, over here. Do we have a laser pointer? No, we don't need one. I'll use the mouse. And half the subjects saw him donate money regularly to charities, and the other half of the subjects saw him not donating money to Muslim charities. He always liked rock climbing, which harkens back to Kathy's introduction. Not a coincidence. I do like tacos and ice cream. That part is just weird. We measured how much you trusted Ali. Do you think he's trustworthy? Would you trust him with a sensitive secret? And then we're really lucky to have a colleague on this grant, Roger Mayer, who's a leading trust researcher from the University of NC State, North Carolina State University Management School. And he's got this idea that we trust people because they have certain abilities, they're benevolent, and they have integrity. And the first thing that we found was that there was absolutely no effect of whether that target person was Christian or Muslim on how much you trusted them. That was contrary to our hypotheses. We also found absolutely no effect of whether they said they believed in a forgiving or punishing God. But what we did find was a main effect such that if the person was charitable or costly signaled, they were trusted more than if they did not. Now, you might remember from a few slides ago that the real hypothesis was that that would help trustworthiness if this was an in-group member, but hurt trustworthiness if this was an out-group member. So I looked at that on the next slide, and actually, we found no interaction that way. What we found was that if the target person was Christian, and they costly signaled or gave to charity, they were more trusted than if they didn't. And the same was true if they were Muslim, an out-group member. So that's a very surprising and counter to our hypotheses finding. So we thought maybe they didn't really notice that the guy was saying in all this text that he was Muslim. It was just one of the little things that he said, along with liking tacos and liking the color green. So we did a second study where we made the target people more obviously Muslim or not. Same thing, and we got the very same results. If they're Christian, they get helped by costly signaling in terms of their trust, and if they're Muslim, they do too. So in a third study, we wanted to replicate this general finding using different methods, because we thought, well, this person is giving charity in these scenarios. Maybe people look at that and they say that's a very nice and trustworthy thing to do. Maybe it's not that they're Muslim, maybe it's not that they're giving to Muslim charities, maybe it's that they're being pro-social. So in the third study, we gave people a scenario about a guy named Sam or Samir. He goes to a work event, it's a dinner party at a steakhouse, and it's Lent, and Sam is Catholic and he shouldn't be eating the meat. And he either does eat it or he doesn't. Or the meat is not halal, and Samir is Muslim and he really shouldn't eat the meat, and he does anyway, or else he doesn't. Or else we didn't tell them anything about whether he ate or didn't eat. And what we find using this different method is the same thing. If he's Catholic and he engages in costly signaling, in this case that's not eating meat during Lent, he's more trusted than if we give no information or if he eats it anyway. And we get the same pattern of results with a Muslim target person. So these are all self-reported measures of trust. And Will Gervais, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, he thinks that people can lie about how much they trust other people. And so what Will loves to do is to take advantage of the conjunction fallacy in his research. The conjunction fallacy is when Linda is not just a bank teller, but she's a bank teller and a feminist. Do all of you know? Clive, you don't know what that is. There's this woman, Linda, who was a very active student demonstrator and stuff, and now she works in a bank. Do you think it's more probable that Linda is a bank teller, or do you think it's more probable that Linda is a bank teller and a feminist? And most people will say that second choice, because even though the conjoint probability of two things happening together cannot be higher than the probability of one of those things, people think that Linda really sounds like she's a feminist, and so they pick that second choice. So Will Gervais takes advantage of this. And he's gone to 13, Jordan, societies around the world and said there's this guy named Jordan. He's a serial killer. Do you think that Jordan is a school teacher? Or do you think Jordan is a school teacher and an atheist? And in every society that's been studied, Gervais finds that people like to think he's both a school teacher and an atheist if he's behaving immorally. So we did that. Mr. R had an interesting day. He did a bunch of immoral things. He backed into somebody's car and he pretended to write down his insurance information, but he didn't. And he found somebody's wallet, and he could have given them back their money, but he didn't. And so what do you think is more likely? Is Mr. R Catholic is he Catholic and costly signals? We didn't say costly signals. We said he obeys all of his complicated religious rules. Or is he Catholic and he doesn't do that? So what do we find? Steve, you were right, I am going to walk around, finally. It's good I have a lapel mic. You should pick this answer, right? That's not committing the conjunction fallacy. But if you do commit the conjunction fallacy, if Mr. R behaved in a very untrustworthy way, virtually all of the people who committed the conjunction fallacy in some direction assumed that he was not religious. He didn't costly signal. Whereas if he behaved in a very trustworthy way, some people don't commit the conjunction fallacy. It's more here than here. I don't know why that is. But of the people that do commit the conjunction fallacy, almost all of them, 55 out of 60, thought that he did obey his religion's rules. Now, the reason why Gervais likes this method so much is it's not subject to the kinds of self-report biases that all of the prior methods rely on. You can't just sort of lie your way out of saying, well, he's Muslim and I don't trust him, but I can't say that, that's un-PC. So this is a little bit more subtle and a little bit more tricky, and you get the same pattern of results if you have a Muslim target person. So some people don't commit the conjunction fallacy at all. If he behaved in an untrustworthy way, 77 out of 82 of the people that did commit the conjunction fallacy in some direction thought that he was not religious, whereas if Mr. R had been highly trustworthy, of those people that did commit the conjunction fallacy, 68 out of these 75, almost all of them, thought that he was more religious. He did adhere to Muslim costly signaling. So that's a little bit of evidence that people aren't just lying to us. And here's some more. So I mentioned that Gene is a co-PI on this grant. So we did EEGs on people as they were making these trust decisions. And we looked at the correlation between their trust decisions and alpha suppression at the PZ electrode. Okay? I don't know what that means. P is parietal and Z is midline. And this is some brainwave that you're showing. I think it's alpha.
You're really doing it.
Alpha.
Keep going.
Alpha activity. It might be an orienting response that puts you in a mindset to trust people. And then the trust decisions that you make in a subsequent behavioral trust task. I have no idea, Leona, what that means. But it's your brainwaves. It's your brainwaves, okay? And when you break down the correlation between people's brainwaves and their trust decisions, you can see that there are positive correlations when the person is costly signaling, and that's 4 out of 4 times, and 3 out of 4 times when they're not costly signaling. Whereas these correlations are not evident and non-significant when you break them down by whether they're Christian or Muslim. So even and Gene, you can explain this better in a second, but even your brain waves are following the same pattern that your costly signaling is much more important than what religion you belong to. Now, Gene, why don't you explain what I just tried to say?
It's a lot less attention demanding, neurophysiologically speaking, to trust somebody when they're costly signaling. Doesn't require as much focused effort.
Isn't that what I said? No,
That's exactly what you said.
That is what I said. I have no idea what I actually said because I've heard Gene talk about these data to the Air Force, and I tried to repeat the words that I had heard him say. And it doesn't matter what religion the person is, even in your brainwaves. So we don't think that people are just lying to us. Well, why is that? Does anybody know who Super Y is? Nobody has little kids? Okay, it's just me. Despite religions being in some ways different, this doesn't necessarily erode trust and can even promote it. But why? As Super Y. No one has little kids. Well, one reason goes back to this theory by Roger Mayer, our colleague at NC State. So you can look at a Facebook profile like this, and this status, it's a little hard to see, I'm sorry, now that I can see it on the slide. This guy, he's a painter, and he got taken out to lunch by his boss to a Korean barbecue restaurant. And it turns out that he, as a religious Muslim, he wasn't supposed to eat the meat, and he either didn't or he did. Or Isa was Christian or Catholic, Stephanie? He was some variety of, he was Catholic, and it was Lent, let's say, I think that was it, right? And he wasn't supposed to eat the meat?
He has the rosary.
Right, he's Catholic and he's not supposed to eat the meat, and he doesn't. And we find again that this promotes more trust. But in this study, we were trying to figure out what the process is. And by this time, they had invented bootstrapping and so on. And we looked at 4 possible mediators. Creds is this theory by these people at the University of British Columbia and Joe Henrich now at Harvard, that the reason why religions spread is because people engage in credibility enhancing displays. Creds, those are behaviors that make you feel that the person really believes what they say they believe. Okay? And then we had ability, benevolence, and integrity, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, that Mayer thinks are influences on trust. And what we find is that when the guy costly signals he doesn't eat the meat that he's supposed to not eat, he is perceived as believing what he says he believes, more so than when he does eat the meat he's not supposed to. But that does not translate into more trust. And then we have ability, benevolence, and integrity, which do show some mediating roles. But if you look at the percent, these 81 and 80 are the percent of the effect that is explained by these mediators. Almost all of the effect that's explained is carried by this one variable, integrity. When you see somebody not eating meat that they're not supposed to eat, you perceive them as being higher in integrity. And that seems to be why you trust them more. And to make Dave happy, we wanted to manipulate integrity to show that that had a causal effect on the DV. And so we did a similar experiment where you're thinking of hiring this house painter, and it turns out your friend has used that house painter. So you ask your friend, what did you think of Isa as a painter? And we manipulated in a 2x2 experiment those credibility enhancing displays I mentioned a minute ago. We manipulated that even though that wasn't a significant mediator in the correlational data, because those guys at UBC and at Harvard are really famous for this theory. We really wanted to give it a chance. And we also manipulated integrity. So your friend, with regard to creds, credibility enhancing displays, said, this guy really seemed to believe in his religion. Or he said, he really didn't seem to believe in his religion after all. And we manipulated that independently in a 2x2 design with high or low integrity. This guy really seemed to have integrity. He really seemed to stick to his word, and he charged me when he said he was going to charge me, and he finished the job when he said he was going to finish the job, and so on. And what did we find? We found that manipulating creds had very little effect on the trustworthiness of this painter and willingness to hire him, but manipulating integrity had a much bigger effect. Partial eta squared of 0.26 versus 0.003. 0.26 is bigger than 0.003. So we really think that integrity is one reason by which these religious signals affect trustworthiness. And we think there's one more. Another reason is because of the kinds of lives that religious people seem to lead that non-religious or irreligious people don't seem to lead. And this is work with Jamie Krems and Jordan Moon, which is in present psychological science. So again, following the same general paradigm as all of the experiments I've talked about so far, you see a Facebook profile, and Jordan, help me out here. This guy either identifies himself as a devoted Christian or as a non-religious person in this first experiment. And then we do a big fancy mediation analysis, which is impossible to read because of the color scheme on this slide. But we measure basically the same things that I've been talking about. Big gods, it's a little, how much is this guy afraid that God will punish him if he misbehaves? Does really not show a mediating effect. But what do show mediating effects are the kinds of things that go with this target person leading a dependable, stable, trustworthy life. So he's living out what some evolutionary psychologists or biologists might call a slow life history strategy, which lets him make decisions in a non-impulsive, cooperative, deliberate way, as opposed to being impulsive and non-trustworthy for that reason. So what we did show in this experiment is that perceptions that he's not impulsive, that he's non-opportunistic, and that he's more highly educated help to explain the effect of his religion on his trustworthiness. So Jordan has been claiming that what is really important about religious people is not their religious behaviors and their beliefs per se, but the kinds of lives they lead. And so what happens if you know whether someone is religious or not, That might give you hints about the kinds of lives they lead, but what if you have direct information about the kinds of lives they lead? So in a second experiment, we manipulated both of those things. So this same guy described himself as non-religious or as a devoted Christian, I think. And he also described himself as somebody who had a goal to find someone special, settle down, start a family, or to play the field. So those were manipulated independently. You could have a non-religious person who wanted to settle down, a non-religious person who wanted to play the field. You could have a devoted Christian who wanted to settle down, and you could have a devoted Christian who wanted to play the field. And what happens on trustworthiness? Well, if the person has an uncommitted strategy, according to their little profile that you saw a minute ago, whether they were religious or not had very little effect on their trustworthiness. Now, whether they were religious or not also had very little effect on their trustworthiness if they said they wanted to lead a committed life in terms of settling down. But if you look at the main effect of that committed versus on the right versus uncommitted strategy on the left, you can see that the settle down kind of guy is trusted much more than the uncommitted guy. And this is having a much bigger influence than whether they're religious or whether they're non-religious in both of those conditions. So Jordan and Jamie are making the case that religion has a lot to do with your trustworthiness because of the kind of life that you lead. Okay, and so just to give you effect sizes for the importance of those two variables that I just mentioned, this 0.197, committed strategists are trusted much more than non-committed people. That effect size is 0.197, much, much bigger than the effect that being religious versus not has on your trustworthiness, 0.008. So to sum up, the research that brought me to ASU was the claim that religions really are sometimes meaningfully different from each other, not just in their theology, but in their cultures, in the way that this is expressed in psychological processes, like morality and like attribution. Nevertheless, we can all still trust each other to a greater extent. And religion, rather than being a barrier to how much we trust each other, religion is actually something that can facilitate greater trust between groups. And why is that? That seems to be due to two factors that we've identified in our research so far: integrity and perceptions of leading a committed reproductive strategy, a slow life history strategy, rather than a fast, uncommitted life history strategy. And so I want to thank you all very much for coming today. I know that the timing was a little bit tricky with the upcoming holidays. I know a lot of our colleagues aren't here because of family coming into town for Easter and Passover and cooking and so on. And I want to thank all of my students, some of which I've mentioned their research today, and others of which, the research is going in equally important directions, and yet it just didn't fit as neatly into the themes that I was developing today, like Joe and Matt, for example. So I want to thank you for all of your collaborations over the years. And I want to thank everyone in the room who voted for my promotion. I'm really, truly honored to be a full professor in this austere department. So, and Kathy, one more thank you for your great introduction. Thank you very much.